Newport, Rhode Island. The sea claws at the cliffs as a 19-year-old mill girl steps into a law office and into a bargain she never chose. An inheritance beyond imagining, tied to a single shattering clause: marry a bankrupt widower twice her age. Beyond the gates waits a mansion of shuttered windows, a family ruled by silence, and a benefactor's letter that whispers of a past returning to claim her. Duty pulls one way, desire another. Pride stands guard. And somewhere in the dark, a secret sharp enough to cut through love. Tell me where you're listening from, and one more thing. What do you crave most in period romances, grand balls, forbidden vows, or hard-won redemption? Newport, Rhode Island, 1898. The sea beyond the cliffs was restless that morning, its foam breaking against the jagged rocks like a reminder that even beauty could bear the weight of sorrow. Within the grey-stoned walls of a small Providence law office, the future of a young woman's life was about to be rewritten with the ink of fate. Grace Bennet sat on the edge of a wooden chair, her gloved hands resting tightly in her lap. The scent of damp paper and old ink filled the air. Sunlight filtered through tall windows veiled by lace curtains, turning dust motes into fragments of gold. She had never been inside such a room before, a place where silence had authority and every breath carried consequence. Her heart beat fast beneath her modest blouse, and when the lawyer finally lifted his eyes, her entire world shifted. "Miss Bennet," he began, his tone polite but distant, "you have been named the sole heir to the estate and fortune of the late Mr. Cyrus Winslow." Grace blinked in disbelief. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. "I don't know any Mr. Winslow." The lawyer's spectacles glinted as he adjusted them. "The deceased had personal dealings with your mother many years ago. He spoke of her with respect. It seems he regarded you as a daughter in spirit, if not by blood." He paused, studying her with professional caution. "However, his generosity is not without condition." Grace's pulse faltered. "Condition?" The lawyer's voice did not tremble, though the weight of what he read would have made any ordinary man hesitate. "To claim your inheritance, Miss Bennet, you must enter into matrimony with Mr. Silas Weatherly of Newport, a gentleman of 52 years, formerly of great means, now facing unfortunate reversals." The words echoed in the room, as if the walls themselves wished to swallow them. Grace felt the air tighten in her lungs. Marry a stranger, a man old enough to have been her father. The lawyer continued, detailing the legalities, the deadlines, the signatures required. Yet Grace heard nothing but the hollow rhythm of her heart. She rose slowly, her chair scraping the floor. "Why would anyone ask such a thing of me?" He sighed, folding his hands. "Mr. Winslow wrote, in his final letter, that Miss Bennet may restore what pride alone could not. Whatever he meant by that, he seemed certain this union was necessary for both your salvation and Mr. Weatherly's." Outside, the carriages rumbled past, their wheels grinding over cobblestones. The city was alive, indifferent to the life that had just been unmade and remade within that quiet office. Grace's reflection in the window looked older than 19, her hazel eyes shadowed by questions she dared not ask aloud. Poverty had taught her endurance, but not obedience. Yet in that instant, her thoughts turned to the cold room she shared with two other mill girls, to the hollow ache of hunger that visited her more faithfully than any friend. "I will do it," she said softly, before courage could abandon her. "If it was my mother's wish or his, I will go." The lawyer nodded once, sealing her future with a stroke of his pen. The journey to Newport took half a day. The countryside rolled past in somber greens and greys as Grace sat by the window of the hired carriage, her hands wrapped tightly around the letter of introduction. The road wound upward until the scent of the sea replaced the smell of the mills, and the horizon opened into mist and grandeur. Newport was another world. Its mansions glittered with windows like mirrors to a sky that had never bent toward her before. When the carriage stopped before the Weatherly estate, Grace felt a chill, unlike any she had known. The house rose from the fog like a wounded monument, stone darkened by salt, shutters closed as if the very walls wished to keep their secrets. No music, no laughter, no light, just a single lamp flickering behind the beveled glass of the front door. A tall, austere man opened it. His coat was impeccable, though frayed at the cuffs, his hair streaked with silver. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice low, formal, distant. "I am Silas Weatherly. You'd best come in. The rain is turning." Grace stepped over the threshold and into a silence so deep she could hear the sea breathing beyond the cliffs. The foyer smelled faintly of salt and smoke. Portraits stared from the walls, faces of men with hard eyes, women with pearls at their throats, all frozen in judgment. The marble floor, once polished to a mirror's gleam, bore faint cracks beneath her boots. Silas gestured toward the parlor. "You must forgive the house. It is not what it once was." Grace's gaze traveled over faded draperies and furniture covered in dust sheets. "It's beautiful," she said, though her voice trembled. "Beauty fades," he murmured, turning toward the fire that struggled in the grate, "like fortune, like pride." His words lingered in the room, heavy as the scent of rain beginning to fall outside. She watched him from the corner of her eye, the rigid posture, the hands that seemed too restless for stillness, the shadow of something unspoken behind his measured tone. "You are very young," he said suddenly, not turning to look at her. 19, she replied. "That is younger than I expected." Grace's chin lifted slightly, a spark of defiance flickering in her composure. "And you, Mr. Weatherly, are older than I expected." His head turned, and for a brief second their eyes met. The air between them changed. Something fragile and electric pulsed there, neither hostility nor warmth, only the raw acknowledgement of two lives forced together by the will of the dead. After a long pause, Silas spoke again, his tone softer. "You will find this household reserved. My children are not accustomed to strangers." "I'm not accustomed to luxury," Grace answered quietly. "I suppose we will both be learning." A faint, unwilling smile ghosted across his lips before it vanished. "Mrs. Talbot will show you to your room." When the housekeeper appeared, a sturdy woman with a ring of keys at her waist and a cautious kindness in her eyes, Grace followed her up the wide staircase. Each step creaked like an old confession. She felt the weight of unseen eyes, of whispers caught behind doors. In the distance, the ocean roared. From the landing window, Grace could see the cliffs below, the waves crashing mercilessly against stone. Somewhere out there, she imagined, the same sea that had carried Mr. Winslow's ships and Silas Weatherly's fortune, now watched her arrival in silence. She pressed her palm against the cold glass. "Restore what pride alone could not," she murmured to herself. "What did you mean, Mr. Winslow?" Outside, the rain fell harder, striking the glass like quiet applause or warning. And as night settled upon the great dim house by the sea, Grace Bennet realized that her life, which had always belonged to necessity, now belonged to destiny. The morning light in Newport had a peculiar stillness to it, as if the sun itself hesitated to shine too brightly on the Weatherly estate. Mist lingered in the hollows of the grounds, curling over the dew-glazed hedges and creeping along the edges of cracked flagstones. From the second-floor window of her chamber, Grace stood in silence, her breath fogging the glass as she surveyed the garden below. It was beautiful in its neglect, with rose bushes untamed and a marble fountain gone dry, its once singing waters silenced by time and misfortune. The room behind her was grand by every measure she had known. The bed alone could have held 3 of her childhood cots, and the wardrobe still held faint traces of lavender and old wood polish. But the silence weighed more than the finery. The walls bore no portraits, no embroidered samplers, no signs of a woman's touch. The curtains hung heavy, and the fireplace had not been lit in what seemed like months. There was elegance, but no warmth. A sharp knock came at the door. Without waiting for an answer, Mrs. Talbot entered. She wore a dark wool dress that brushed the floor, a white apron perfectly starched, and a cluster of silver keys jingling faintly at her waist like a muted bell of authority. "Breakfast is in the morning room," the housekeeper announced without ceremony. "The children eat first. Mr. Weatherly takes his tray separately." Grace turned from the window. "And I?" "You'll join them," Mrs. Talbot replied, then added after a pause, "if they remain." There was no hostility in her tone, only weariness worn into the grain of her voice like age into oak. Grace nodded, smoothed the front of her dove-grey skirt, and followed her down the corridor. The house revealed itself in shadows. Along the way, Grace passed rooms sealed with dust cloths, paintings dulled by a film of neglect, and stair rails polished only by time. The silence was not the silence of peace, but of things unspoken. The scent of sea salt mingled with faded wood and wax, and occasionally the air stirred with a draught from unseen windows. The morning room had once been lovely. It still held a pair of French doors that overlooked the garden, but the lace curtains were drawn, and only one oil lamp flickered on a nearby table. Two children sat at the end of a long, narrow dining table, so far from one another that it might have been a negotiation rather than a meal. The girl, Caroline, sat erect in her chair, her pinafore pristine, her reddish-blonde hair braided into two tight plaits tied with matching navy ribbons. She glanced up as Grace entered, her gaze cool and unreadable. Beside her, a boy, no more than 8, fiddled with a spoon. His sandy hair flopped over his brow, and his eyes barely lifted to meet Grace's before darting back to his bowl. "Good morning," Grace offered gently. Neither replied. Mrs. Talbot cleared her throat. "Miss Grace will be staying with us. You may show her the grounds this afternoon." Caroline's fork froze mid-air. "That won't be necessary," she said without looking up. Mrs. Talbot did not flinch. "I said you may." The housekeeper vanished into the hallway, her skirts sweeping with authority. Grace hesitated before sitting opposite the children, unsure if her presence was an intrusion or a test. She reached for her tea, its steam curling upward like a sigh. Silence fell again, this time more brittle. "Do you like it here?" Edward asked softly, his voice so delicate it could have belonged to a ghost. Grace looked at him, her smile kind. "It's quiet and very grand." Caroline spoke sharply before Edward could answer. "It's falling apart. The drawing room leaks, the roof in the east corridor is rotting, and half the staff have left." "Caroline," Edward murmured, shrinking slightly, but the girl did not retreat. She turned her gaze on Grace, sharp, intelligent, and aged beyond her years. "Why did you come here?" Grace considered her words before answering. "Because someone believed I should." "Mr. Winslow?" the girl asked. "He never met you." "No," Grace said quietly, "but he knew of me. He knew my mother." Caroline blinked, but said nothing more. Edward dropped his spoon. Later that morning, Grace wandered the west wing alone, her steps tentative on the worn rugs. She peeked into unused parlours, drawing rooms with dust-muted mirrors, and shelves where books leaned like weary travellers. In one room, the pianoforte stood closed, its keys untouched. In another, a broken ship's model rested on the hearth. It was as though the house had been abandoned while still inhabited. From an open door, she heard voices, low, male, frayed by years. "I don't care for appearances anymore, Clarence. I've no more pride to sell." Grace halted just outside the room. "You have her now," came the response, oily and amused. "That's something." Silas Weatherly's voice dropped to a warning growl. "Do not speak of her as if she were merchandise." "She is merchandise," the man replied. "That's what makes her useful." Grace stepped back, heart pounding. She did not wait to hear more. That afternoon, Mrs. Talbot found her in the garden, pruning dead rose heads with bare fingers. "There's a dinner this evening," she said briskly. "The Graves family." "Mr. Weatherly insisted." Grace straightened. "Will I be expected to dine with them?" Mrs. Talbot's brow lifted, amused despite herself. "You are his wife, are you not?" Grace swallowed hard. "In name. In Newport. Name is enough." That night, Grace stood before the mirror, adjusting the collar of her evening gown. It was navy silk, one of 2 dresses the solicitor had provided upon her arrival, and though well made, it lacked the ornamentation of society fashion. Her hair was pinned simply, her only adornment a small gold cross at her throat. She looked more like a governess than a hostess, but there was dignity in her simplicity. Downstairs the parlour had been prepared for guests. Candles lit the corners, and wine glimmered in crystal glasses. Grace entered quietly, shoulders square, pulse galloping beneath her stays. The guests were already gathered. Lillian Graves stood by the hearth, swathed in ivory silk and pearls, her laughter low and rehearsed. Her father, a stout man with a crimson waistcoat, was holding court beside the decanter. When Grace entered, silence rippled through the room. "My," Lillian said, her voice sugar-coated venom. "So you are the girl everyone is talking about." Grace offered a cordial nod. "Mrs. Weatherly," she said. "A pleasure." Lillian's smile sharpened. "My apologies. It's just, I hadn't expected Providence's finest textile worker to be so well turned out." A few guests laughed too loudly. Silas, standing near the fireplace, said nothing. He looked away. Grace's cheeks flamed, but she did not flinch. "It's true," she replied, her voice steady. "I spent years weaving thread. Now I am learning to weave conversation." A murmur moved through the room. Lillian's smile faltered. Dinner was served in the long dining room, the table set with heirloom silver and linen once pristine, now slightly yellowed with age. Grace sat at Silas's left, her posture composed, though her soul burned. Throughout the meal, Lillian guided the conversation with veiled barbs, jokes about factory soot, anecdotes about private schools, remarks on new money manners. Each word sliced like silk torn on a nail. Silas remained silent. When dessert arrived, Lillian leaned close, voice low. "Do you know what they say, Grace? That Mr. Weatherly married you for your inheritance, and that you, darling, married him for food." Grace turned to her, her eyes unblinking. "Then let them say it," she murmured. "Let them choke on their own bitterness." Only then did Silas look at her, really look. His eyes met hers across the flickering candlelight, and for the briefest moment regret bloomed in his expression like a storm held at bay. But he still said nothing, and Grace, aching from the silence, rose from the table before the plates had been cleared. She walked from the room with her head high and her heart splintered, not by insult, but by the silence of the man who should have defended her. In the stillness of her chamber, with the sea murmuring beyond the glass, she realized something cruel and beautiful. The Weatherly house was not just broken by debt or time, it was broken by silence. And Grace Bennet would not remain silent forever. The light in the Weatherly library was different than in any other room of the house. It filtered in pale and golden through high, dusty windows, casting long slants of sun across the dark mahogany shelves and worn leather chairs. The scent of the room, parchment, wax, old ink, rose like a memory from the very floorboards. Grace stood still for a moment just inside the threshold, her gloved fingers trailing over the carved panel of the door. This was not a room she had been invited into, yet something about its solemn quiet called to her. The silence in the rest of the house had not lessened. Since the disastrous dinner, the corridors had grown colder, the stairs longer, the silences heavier. Silas remained aloof, retreating deeper into his study. Caroline passed her like a shadow in the halls, chin lifted, voice clipped. Edward alone seemed to draw nearer, trailing her like a quiet thread through the day. His small presence in the garden, at the stairs, near the hearth, always just within reach but never intrusive, became a silent comfort. It was Edward who had told her the library was never locked. Inside, the volumes stretched upward like silent judges. Ledgers, treatises, novels with spines cracked by time. She crossed the room slowly, her boots muffled by the faded carpet, until she came to the broad desk beneath the window. It was a fortress of paper. Receipts, correspondence, shipping manifests, records of wages paid or unpaid. Everything was in disarray. Columns of numbers blurred with smudges, names of creditors written in increasingly hasty scrawls. It was a portrait of decline drawn not in oil, but in ink. She removed her gloves and reached for the most recent ledger. The column marked receivables had been blank for nearly 2 months. Expenses, however, bloomed like a dark flower. Coal delivery, repairs deferred, salaries owed. 2 names were circled at the bottom of the list, the head footman and the cook. Beside them, a single word, dismissed. Grace closed the book slowly, her pulse steady but rising. A second ledger revealed more. The family's last remaining ship, the Winslow Belle, had been docked in Providence since early spring. Its insurance premium was overdue. A red ink note in Silas's hand read simply, "Risk unacceptable. Recommend sale." She stared at those words, as if by will alone she could erase them. Later that day, she requested an audience with Silas Weatherly. He received her in the study, a room as bare and cold as the rest of the house. The fire had not been lit. Dust lingered in the corners. He stood near the window with his back turned, as if prepared to look through her rather than at her. "I would like to discuss the estate," she began. His voice was flat. "The estate is not your concern." "With respect," she said, stepping closer. "That's incorrect. This house is my home now. The staff are under my care. Your children live beneath this roof. If the house collapses, I will not sit in the rubble and pretend I didn't notice." He turned slowly, his face unreadable. "You forget your place, Mrs. Weatherly." "No," she replied. "For the first time, I am beginning to understand it." A long pause stretched between them. The fireplace crackled faintly, though no flame had been set. Silas moved to the decanter and poured himself a small measure of brandy. He did not offer her any. "You've seen the ledgers, then?" he asked. "I have. And what do you propose we do?" There was no curiosity in his voice, only fatigue. Grace raised her chin. "We stop dismissing loyal staff. We reduce unnecessary expenses, yes, but we stop bleeding. The Belle is the last asset of value. Let it sail. Let it earn." He studied her, the brandy untouched in his hand. "It hasn't made a profitable voyage in 2 years." "Because it hasn't sailed in 2 years," she replied, her voice low but firm. "You're afraid of another loss, so you've buried the ship at the docks like a coffin. But it isn't dead. Not yet." He looked at her then, really looked, not with the distant politeness he wore like a cloak, but with something more cautious, more human. "And if it fails?" "Then we fail trying," she said, not hiding. A flicker of something passed through him. Not admiration, he was too proud for that yet, but recognition. "Very well," he murmured. "You may oversee the accounts. The Belle will sail within the fortnight. But do not mistake action for security. This house cannot be rescued by optimism." Grace inclined her head. "It can't be rescued by silence either." She left the room without waiting for dismissal. That evening she returned to the library alone. Candlelight danced along the shelves as she moved through the files, sorting the financial chaos into ledgers she could understand. After an hour, her fingers touched the edge of a leather folder buried beneath discarded correspondence. Curious, she drew it out and opened the flap. Inside was a letter, old and yellowed, bearing the Weatherly seal. Her breath caught at the signature, Cyrus Winslow. She unfolded the parchment slowly. The ink had faded but remained legible. "To Captain Weatherly, I trust the girl is well. Her mother served on the Belle with loyalty and care. She spoke often of her daughter Grace and her hopes that the child might one day live a life not measured by wages, but by worth. If anything should ever befall me, see that she is remembered. And if there is any debt between you and me, let this letter settle it." Winslow's hand was bold and slanted, like a man accustomed to command. Grace's fingers trembled as she touched the closing line. "The child carries more than her mother's name. She carries her strength." She folded the letter again and held it to her chest. Her mother. a stewardess on a weatherly ship. She had never known. A noise startled her, a footstep behind her. She turned quickly. Caroline stood in the doorway, half in shadow. "You shouldn't be in here," the girl said, her voice cool. "I didn't realize it was forbidden," Grace replied, recovering her composure. "It isn't. It's just no one goes in here anymore." Grace hesitated. "Did your mother use this room?" Caroline stepped forward, her posture tight. "Sometimes. She used to read to Edward by the window. After she died, Father locked the books. I suppose now they belong to you." The accusation was soft but sharp. Grace softened her tone. "I'm not here to replace anyone, Caroline." The girl's expression didn't change. "Then why are you here?" Grace didn't answer. Some truths needed more time than a night to speak. Caroline turned to go, then paused. "Edward likes you," she said almost grudgingly. "But he likes ghosts too. Be careful." Then she vanished into the hallway, leaving Grace alone in the golden hush of the room, the candle flickering beside her, the letter still warm against her chest. That night, Grace could not sleep. She sat beside the small writing desk in her chamber, pen in hand, trying to find words for a mother she could no longer ask. The sea roared below the cliffs, as relentless as the silence within the house. The bell would sail again, and Grace, once a mill girl, now a mistress of a home of shadows, would learn to steer her own course, even if no one else believed she could. The morning of the Weatherlys' invitation to the Marchand soirée dawned grey, with the kind of heavy mist that seemed to hang low over the sea, like an omen. From the windows of her chamber, Grace watched the fog drift through the garden and gather along the stone path, wrapping the hedges in a ghostly veil. Newport society had awakened from its winter lethargy, and invitations were now fluttering through town, like butterflies with gilded wings. The Marchand's affair promised to be the first grand evening of the season, and for Silas Weatherly, attendance was not a choice, it was an obligation. Mrs. Talbot had appeared at Grace's door earlier that morning, arms laden with gowns wrapped in muslin. "The modiste sent these from Bellevue Avenue," she said. "Mr. Weatherly insisted you have something new. The Marchands entertain the entire coast, and the lady of this house must look the part." Grace had wanted to protest, but the older woman's expression brooked no refusal. Now, as she stood before her mirror, Grace touched the pale lilac silk of her new gown. The colour softened the warm tones of her skin, and the high lace collar framed her slender throat like a whisper of snow. Her hair was pinned in a loose knot at the nape of her neck, a few curls falling against her temples. She studied herself in silence, neither satisfied nor vain, only contemplative. The girl who had once walked through factory soot now looked back at her with unfamiliar calm, as though she had belonged to this world all along. When she descended the staircase that evening, the sound of her skirts brushing the wood seemed loud in the stillness. Silas was waiting in the hall. He stood by the door, his black coat perfectly pressed, his white gloves immaculate. His gaze lifted at the sound of her step, and for the first time since their marriage, he hesitated. "You look—" His voice faltered, then steadied. "Appropriate." Grace smiled faintly, aware of the compliment hidden beneath restraint. "That will have to do." The carriage ride was quiet but charged, filled with the kind of silence that felt like speech waiting to happen. Grace sat opposite Silas, the lantern outside casting shifting patterns of light across his face. He seemed older tonight, not merely by years, but by the weight of something invisible. Responsibility, regret, perhaps both. His gloved hand rested on his knee, fingers tightening each time the horses jolted the carriage. She wanted to ask what occupied his thoughts, but pride kept her still. When they arrived, the Marchand residence blazed with light. The grand ballroom shimmered beneath a dozen crystal chandeliers. Women in gowns of rose and ivory floated like petals across polished floors, and the air was thick with perfume and laughter. Grace felt the press of eyes as she entered, some curious, others cruel. Her name had already travelled through parlours and drawing rooms, stitched with rumour. Silas offered his arm. "Stay close," he murmured, his tone more command than request. But the crowd soon swallowed them. At the edge of the ballroom, Grace found herself approached by a man whose presence drew notice even before he spoke. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his hair slicked back with oil, his waistcoat a deep crimson that gleamed beneath the lights. His smile was a study in practiced charm, though his eyes betrayed amusement more than warmth. "Mrs. Weatherly," he said smoothly, bowing. "Or may I say Miss Bennet? I confess, I've heard your name whispered often enough this season." Grace stiffened. "You may call me Mrs. Weatherly, Mr. Hoyle, Clarence Hoyle." He offered his hand, and something in the way he lingered over the gesture made her skin prickle. "An old friend of your husband's, though I dare say he might not use that word anymore." The name struck her like a sudden draught, so this was the man whose dealings had ruined the Weatherly name. She had imagined someone colder, less vivid, but here he was, smiling as if their misfortune amused him. "I understand we owe you much," she said evenly, refusing to look away. His grin widened. "Oh, not to me, my dear. To fate, perhaps, or to your late benefactor, who left you quite the puzzle to solve." He leaned closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "A young bride with an old husband, and a fortune not yet her own. It is quite the tale." Grace met his gaze without flinching. "And yet you seem eager to tell it." Before he could respond, Silas appeared at her side. The tension between the two men was immediate, electric. "Hoyle," Silas said curtly, "I see the rats are still permitted at respectable gatherings." Hoyle's smile never faltered. "And I see the Weatherlys still prefer poetry to profit. How very noble." "You will not speak to my wife again," Silas said. "Your wife?" Hoyle drawled. "Ah, of course, a convenient term, though I wonder how long it will remain convenient for either of you." The exchange drew subtle attention. Nearby guests began to glance their way, pretending not to listen while clearly straining to hear. Grace touched Silas's arm lightly, urging restraint. The contact was brief, but the heat of it lingered. "Come," she whispered, "it isn't worth it." Silas's jaw tightened, but he let her lead him away. Across the room, Lillian Graves watched with the satisfaction of a predator. She wore emerald satin that clung to her like envy itself, and the feather in her hair quivered each time she tilted her head to observe. When Grace passed her, Lillian's lips curved. "What a delicate creature," she murmured to her companions. "I wonder if she knows the scent of scandal suits her better than perfume." That night, the rumor took root. By the time Grace and Silas left the Marchand house, whispers had begun to weave themselves through the carriages waiting outside. The story was simple, poisonous, and irresistible. Grace Bennet, the factory girl who had bewitched a grieving widower for his fortune. The following days moved like a slow, bruising storm. Invitations that had once arrived daily now stopped altogether. Ladies who had nodded politely now crossed the street to avoid her. Even the grocer's wife, who had once curtsied, greeted her with narrowed eyes. Grace bore it with quiet dignity, but the humiliation burned in her like a fever. Silas withdrew further, burying himself in work and correspondence. She saw him mostly at dinner, where conversation was sparse. His silence wounded her more than gossip ever could. One afternoon, unable to endure the oppressive stillness of the house, Grace retreated to the garden. The sea wind tore through her hair, cold and sharp. She stood among the overgrown roses, breathing in the salt and the memory of everything she had lost. Freedom, respect, certainty. "Mrs. Weatherly?" The voice came from behind her. It was Hoyle. She turned slowly, anger flaring. "You should not be here." He smiled, holding his hat to his chest. "The gate was open. I came to offer an apology for the unpleasantness at the Marchands. Society can be cruel to women like you. Women like me? Beautiful, unprotected, necessary. His tone was oily, confident. "I could help you, you know. I have influence in matters of reputation." And I have friends who could make your husband's debts disappear if you were inclined to assist me." Grace stepped back, her voice low and controlled. "I would sooner drown in that sea than owe you anything." His eyes darkened. "Be careful, Mrs. Weatherly. Newport forgives many sins, but not arrogance from the undeserving." He left through the side gate, his laughter carried off by the wind. That evening, Grace found Silas in his study. He was seated at his desk, sleeves rolled, spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. The light from the lamp cast his face in half-shadow, accentuating the hollows beneath his eyes. "I saw him today," she said, standing in the doorway. "Hoyle." His pen stilled. "What did he want?" "To insult me, to threaten me." Silas rose, anger tightening his voice. "You should have sent for me." "I don't need rescuing," she replied softly. "I need truth." What did he mean when he said the ruin of this house wasn't entirely his doing? He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the battle in him, between pride and honesty, between fear and trust. "Some debts," he said finally, "cannot be paid with money." It was not an answer, and yet it told her everything she needed to know. The shadows that haunted this house were not only born of loss, they were born of secrets. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Grace." She looked back. "You must not believe what they say," he said quietly. "About you, about us." For the first time, there was something fragile in his tone, a hint of remorse that softened the iron of his reserve. "I don't," she said, "but I think you do." Their eyes met, his weary, hers defiant. The air between them vibrated with something unnamed, something that frightened them both. Outside, the fog rolled in again, swallowing the last light of the day. And within the Weatherly house, beneath its crumbling grandeur, Grace understood that truth and ruin often shared the same face, and that hers had only just begun to reveal itself. The wind shifted just after midnight. It swept in off the sea, cool and sharp, slipping through the Weatherly house like a sigh through a confession. Grace stirred in her bed, half awake, the flickering shadows on the ceiling mimicking the movement of waves. The fire in her grate had long since faded to embers, and the silence was nearly complete, except for a sound that did not belong. It came again, a cry, sharp, ragged, young. She was up before she could think, her bare feet silent against the hallway's worn runner as she followed the sound to the east wing. As she turned the final corner, the scream tore through the corridor like a wound torn open. "No, no, don't let it sink, Papa, please, don't!" "Edward!" She rushed into his room. The boy was tangled in the sheets, his arms flailing, his breath coming in frantic gasps. His cheeks were flushed, soaked with sweat, and his wide eyes stared at something Grace could not see. "It's all right," she whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed and gathering him into her arms. "Edward, it's Grace. You're safe, you're home." He clutched at her as though drowning, his small hands knotting into the fabric of her nightgown. "It was dark," he sobbed. There were screams. "And the fire, it was under the water, it was wrong." "Hush, sweet one," she murmured, rocking gently. "It's over, just a dream." But the word dream felt like a lie. His terror was too real, too vivid. These were not the shapeless fears of childhood. These were memories. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Mrs. Talbot appeared in the doorway, her robe fastened tightly, hair pinned in a hastily gathered bun. "What happened?" she asked, voice low but urgent. "A night terror," Grace replied. "He's trembling. He said something about fire and water and screams." Mrs. Talbot's expression changed. Something passed through her eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps guilt, but it vanished too quickly to name. "He's had them since the wreck," the housekeeper said, stepping closer, "but not in months." Grace tucked a lock of hair behind Edward's ear. His breathing had begun to slow, though his fingers remained tight against her arm. "He remembers," Grace said softly. "Not clearly, but enough to carry the weight." Mrs. Talbot nodded once. "They all do, even if they don't speak of it." Later, when Edward had finally fallen back into uneasy sleep, Grace lingered outside his room. The corridor was quiet again, but her thoughts roared louder than the ocean. She descended the stairs, barefoot still, her steps drawn toward the library without conscious decision. The door was ajar. A candle had been left burning on the desk, and for a moment the soft flicker made the books look alive, as though the house itself were trying to speak. She sat and reached again for the folder that had contained Winslow's letter. Beneath it, more documents, weather reports, letters, maps, and then a line from a shipping manifest caught her eye. Cargo, ore, textiles, fire barrels, fire barrels. She read it again. Marked as routine, signed by Clarence Hoyle. Grace closed the folder, heart pounding. Something was wrong. The next morning, she found Caroline in the garden, hunched over a journal near the hedge wall. The girl's braids were loose, her pinafore slightly wrinkled, as if she'd risen early and forgotten to fix her uniform. Grace hesitated, then approached. "May I sit?" she asked. Caroline looked up, wary, but nodded. "If you must." Grace folded her hands in her lap. Edward had a nightmare. Caroline stiffened. "He always does when Father's been away. He spoke of fire, screams. He was terrified." Caroline's pencil paused above the paper. "They don't talk about it," she said finally. "The grown-ups. They say it was the storm, but I heard Mr. Hoyle once. He said it wasn't the sea that sank the ship. He said Father should have stopped it." Grace's breath caught. "When did you hear this?" "Last spring. I was meant to be in bed, but the drawing-room windows were open. They argued." Caroline's voice dropped. "Mr. Hoyle said Father let them die to protect the name, that he chose to lose the bell rather than lose everything." Grace's chest tightened. "Do you believe him?" she asked. Caroline looked at her. "I don't know. I used to think Father would never hurt anyone, but now he hardly looks at us. Sometimes I think, maybe he's too ashamed." The truth of that landed like a stone. Grace rose slowly. "Thank you for telling me. I didn't do it for you," Caroline said. "I did it for Edward." That afternoon, Grace sought out Silas in the west study. He was at his desk, sleeves rolled, a pen in hand, but his eyes were far away. When she entered, he didn't rise. He only looked up, and something in her face must have warned him. "You've spoken to the children," he said. "I have," she replied, "and I've seen the manifests and heard Hoyle's words with my own ears." His gaze dropped to the surface of the desk. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice steady but laced with grief. "Was the bell sabotaged? Were lives lost because you hesitated?" The room held its breath. Silas stood, walked to the window, and braced his hand against the sill. The light caught the silver in his hair, the tension in his shoulders. "It was a storm," he said quietly, "but not just a storm." Grace waited. There were materials on board that should never have shipped together, dangerous, flammable. Hoyle assured me the risk was minimal. He exhaled, his voice fraying. "I trusted him, and when the crew reported strange heat in the lower hold, I told them to press on. We were behind schedule. The company was bleeding. I thought we could outrun it." She stepped closer. "But you couldn't." "No," he said, "and men died. Good men, men I should have protected." Grace's throat tightened. "And Hoyle?" "He vanished, claimed he'd warned me, that the signature authorizing the load was mine." Silas turned. "And now he whispers poison into every room, into every ear that matters." She met his eyes. "Then we must silence him." Silas looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Grace." But she held up a hand. "No more silence, Silas. It has already cost too much." Later in the kitchen, Grace confided in Mrs. Talbot. The housekeeper listened without interruption, her hands folded atop the table. "I believe Hoyle orchestrated it," Grace said. "He set the match and let you all burn." Mrs. Talbot's expression darkened. "I've always suspected." "Then help me," Grace pleaded. "Help me uncover what's left of the truth." The older woman hesitated. "Child, if you dig too deep, they'll bury you in it. This world, Newport, the Weatherlys, the society that cloaks its sins in silk, they will never let you rise if you show them your strength." Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "Then I'll rise anyway, even if I must bleed to do it." Mrs. Talbot looked at her for a long time, then nodded once. "I'll bring you the keys to the upstairs files." That night, Grace walked the hallways of the Weatherly estate like a woman haunted. The wallpaper peeled in corners, the chandeliers trembled in the wind, and yet the house felt less like a tomb and more like a battleground. The children had spoken, the silence had cracked, and though the sea still howled beyond the cliffs, Grace no longer feared the storm. She was becoming it. The air inside the Weatherly house had grown thick with something invisible but ever-present, like the charged stillness before a summer storm. It lingered in the stairwell, settled on the banister's polished curve, and clung to the curtains with the weight of breath held too long. Grace could feel it when she rose that morning, an ache in her chest that had no name. She found the note tucked inside the pages of a journal she'd left in the garden parlour. It was folded in perfect thirds, as if handled with care, though the message it carried bore none. "Stop pretending to be a lady." The words were inked in a hurried, almost jagged script. No signature, no seal, only venom dressed as advice. Grace stood motionless for several minutes, staring down at the paper in her hand. The room was silent, but not empty. The scent of dried lavender still clung to the upholstered chairs, and outside the tall windows, the sea murmured softly beneath a veil of morning mist. But the calm was an illusion. Something had shifted, and the paper she held was proof. She did not take the note to Silas. Not yet. Instead, she walked the grounds with a deliberate stillness, watching the staff, watching the gates. She entered the kitchen, where Mrs. Talbot and the scullery maid were shelling peas and made quiet, unassuming conversation. She passed by the drawing room where Caroline sat hunched over her sketchbook, and Edward, curled up like a cat in the window seat, traced the salt fog on the glass with his fingertip. She smiled at them both, though her hands were cold. By late afternoon, the sky had begun to darken prematurely, the clouds hanging low over the cliffs. The wind rattled the panes. Grace lit the fire in the nursery herself and stayed until Edward drifted to sleep beside the hearth, clutching the carved wooden horse she had repaired 2 weeks before. She was about to rise when Caroline, seated in the far corner with a book open in her lap, spoke without looking up. "They don't want you here." Grace turned. "Who?" Caroline's lips were tight. "People. All of them. They think you don't belong, that you're trying to be something you're not." Grace moved closer, kneeling beside her. "And what do you think?" Caroline closed the book slowly. "I think you're the only one who doesn't pretend." There was no warmth in her tone, but neither was there malice. Only the brittle honesty of a girl too old for comfort and too young to carry so much silence. That night the wind rose. It howled against the windows, flung branches against the roof tiles, and sent the kitchen door creaking open despite the latch. Grace had retired early, the anonymous note still folded tightly in the drawer of her nightstand. Sleep came in shallow fits. Her dreams were tangled with footsteps, whispering voices, and the distant toll of ship bells. The scream came just past the hour of 1. Not Edward's this time, but Caroline's. Grace bolted upright, heart in her throat, and ran barefoot into the corridor. The nursery door stood wide. Inside, the fire had been extinguished. Shadows loomed, furniture overturned. The children's trunks flung open, their contents gutted and scattered. Caroline was on her knees near the wall, arms around Edward, shielding him with a ferocity that belied her size. Grace rushed to them. "Are you hurt?" Caroline shook her head, but her eyes were wide with fear. It was Edward who whispered it first. Someone was here. Grace scanned the room, her breath short. Slashed dolls, a broken chair, torn pages from a picture book fluttering near the hearth, and carved into the wood of the toy chest, deep, crude, unmistakable, was a single word: imposter. By the time the staff was roused and lanterns lit, the intruder was gone. No footprints on the floorboards, no broken lock, no face seen. Silas appeared in the doorway moments later, his coat hastily buttoned over his nightshirt, hair disheveled, eyes dark with fury. "What happened?" he demanded. Caroline pointed silently. Silas took in the chaos, the defaced toys, the trembling children. "Edward says someone was in the room," Grace said. "Not long ago." His gaze snapped to hers. "You think it was someone inside the house?" "I think," she said carefully, "that someone has declared war, and they know how to get past our doors." He looked past her to the children, his children, and something inside him broke. He ordered the servants to double the locks, to check every shutter and bolt. He dismissed the footman for failing to hear anything. He paced the nursery, like a man lost in a forest of guilt, and then he turned to Grace. "This is because of you," he said, not in accusation but in devastation. "Because of the name you carry. Because of him." She did not flinch. "Because of Hoyle? Because of the noise that follows you," he said hoarsely. "Because your presence, your defiance, woke something that had been quiet too long. I should have sent you away when I had the chance." Her heart twisted. "Then do it now." He looked at her, eyes filled with something wild. "You think I haven't considered it?" She stepped closer. "Why haven't you?" He was silent for a long moment. Then, "Because I didn't expect to care what would happen to you if I did." The words stunned her, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. She inhaled slowly, trying to master the fire that threatened to rise in her throat. "I never asked for your affection," she said. "Only your honesty." They stood there in the ruined nursery, two figures illuminated by the soft flicker of the rekindled fire. Behind them, the children slept once more, too weary to remain afraid. The firelight cast long shadows on the floor. Their hands were inches apart, not touching, but almost. Outside, the storm raged. Grace turned first, her skirts whispering as she moved toward the hallway. Silas remained, staring into the flames, as though trying to understand what part of him had caught fire. That night, the household did not sleep. Mrs. Talbot brewed strong tea and kept a watch at the end of the corridor. A new lock was fitted to the nursery. Grace remained awake at her writing desk, a candle burning low as she penned names, connections, suspicions on a single sheet of paper. When dawn broke, the sea was still. But within the Weatherly estate, something had changed. Fear had entered, but so had truth, and the war was no longer silent. The spring air was still cool in Newport, but the wind had softened, losing its winter bite. Seagulls circled higher, their cries distant, and the trees lining the Weatherly estate had begun to hint at blossoms not yet bold enough to bloom. Still, the greyness that clung to the corridors of the old house lingered like breath on cold glass, present even in the pale light of morning. It was on such a morning that Caroline entered the study unannounced. She had come looking for a book, or perhaps an answer, and she found both. The door had been left slightly ajar, and Silas, absorbed in sorting papers, had not heard her steps. As she reached for a volume near his desk, her eyes caught a glint of gold. The chain hung loosely from his collar, tucked beneath the fold of his waistcoat. When he bent forward, the pendant slipped free. Not a pendant, a ring. A simple gold band, worn smooth at the edges. "Whose is that?" Caroline's voice was sharp, clipped by the tremor of something she hadn't prepared to feel. Silas looked up too late to hide it. He tucked the ring back beneath his collar with practiced fingers, but the moment had already bloomed between them. "Your mother's," he said quietly. Caroline crossed her arms. "And you still wear it. Even now. Even after—" He stood, his posture suddenly weary. "It doesn't mean what you think." "Doesn't it?" she said, her voice rising. "Because to me it means that Grace is just someone you keep in the house, like the furniture. Not a wife, just a replacement you never wanted." The accusation hung in the air, stark and raw. "She's not a replacement," Silas said. "Then what is she?" Caroline demanded. Silas's gaze faltered. "She is someone I did not expect. Someone who disturbs the quiet I had grown used to." Caroline turned, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of anger and something far more painful, confusion. "Then maybe you should stop pretending we're all still living in the past," she whispered. He did not stop her as she left. The silence after the door closed was deafening. That evening, Grace found Silas alone in the library. He was standing by the hearth, staring into the unlit grate, his right hand wrapped loosely around a crystal tumbler half filled with dark brandy. She knew without asking that he had not eaten dinner. "Mrs. Talbot said you skipped supper," she said softly, not asking, stating. He didn't turn. There didn't seem much point. She stepped closer. The firelight from the nearby lantern caught the edge of his jaw, throwing shadows across the hollow beneath his cheekbone. His coat was slightly rumpled, his collar undone, a rare admission of fatigue. "I spoke with Caroline," she said after a moment. "She was upset." "I know," he replied. "I gave her cause." Grace hesitated. Then quietly, she saw the ring. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he set the glass down on the edge of the mantelpiece and reached into the inside of his coat. When he pulled out the chain, it gleamed softly in the low light. The gold band swung gently from the end, catching the light like a tear frozen mid-air. "I wore it because I didn't know how not to," he said. "I told myself it was for the children, that they needed the memory of their mother as much as I did." He paused, then added, "But the truth is, I wore it because I wasn't ready to let go." Grace didn't move. The only sound between them was the faint crackling of the lantern wick. "Her illness was long," Silas continued, "and I failed her. I drowned myself in my work. I believed that if I built enough, bought enough, expanded far enough, I could buy us more time." His voice cracked, just slightly. "But time," he said, softer now, "is not for sale." Grace's throat tightened. She stepped closer, near enough to see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his mouth trembled beneath control. "I never blamed you," she said gently. He looked at her, startled. "You didn't know her." "I didn't have to," she replied. "To know that mourning is not betrayal." Silas swallowed hard. "I keep thinking," he whispered, "that if I open my heart again, I'll forget her, that the memory will fade." Grace shook her head. "Memory and love are not enemies. They live side by side if we let them." For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly he slipped the chain from around his neck and folded it into his palm. "Will you keep it?" he asked, holding it out. Grace's breath caught. "Silas, as a promise," he said, "that I'll try to live in the present and not just in the ruins." She reached out and closed his hand around it. "Not yet," she said. "Keep it until you're ready to let it go for yourself." The look he gave her then was not one of a man seeking comfort. It was something deeper, something unspoken, a recognition. Later that week, Grace stood in the drawing room before a full-length mirror, adjusting the final touches to her gown. The charity ball she had organized for the local Widows' Relief Fund was a modest affair, hosted in the Marchand Conservatory. She had planned it herself, chosen the guest list, drafted the invitations, and ordered the musicians. She had even written the speech, but now, standing there in her forest green gown, she felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath her composure. The dress had been delivered that morning, an unexpected gift from Silas. The bodice was simple, the sleeves sheer, the waist fitted with subtle boning that lifted her posture but did not constrain her. The fabric shimmered like leaves in early spring, catching every hint of gold the candlelight offered. Her hair was swept into a graceful chignon with a single comb of jet nestled above her ear. Around her neck, no pearls, no jewels, just the soft sheen of skin and the confidence of being seen. When she entered the conservatory that night, the room stilled. It was not a dramatic silence, but one of recognition. Soft, dawning, reverent. She walked across the marble floor with the quiet certainty of a woman who no longer needed permission to exist. Silas met her at the edge of the crowd. He was dressed in formal evening wear, tailcoat, starched white cravat, ivory gloves. But his gaze as he looked at her was not that of a man attending a public event. It was the gaze of a man seeing the present. She extended her hand. He took it, and together they stepped onto the floor as the violins began to play. The waltz was slow, elegant, steeped in memory and possibility. Grace moved with ease, her hand resting lightly on Silas's shoulder, their rhythm finding its own music beneath the notes. Around them, the world receded. As they turned beneath the chandeliers, her eyes met his. Neither spoke, but everything necessary passed between them. Not a vow, not a surrender, just the quiet realization that what had begun in obligation was now something neither of them could name nor deny. And in the stillness between notes, as the candlelight shimmered against glass and silk, Grace felt the faint, unmistakable bloom of something she had not dared to believe in. Hope, not loud, not grand, but alive. The wind carried whispers that week. Newport, ever hungry for gossip, had turned its gaze fully on the Weatherly estate. The air tasted different now, thick with curiosity, sharpened with suspicion. Grace felt it in the glances of shopkeepers, in the silences that followed her entrance into a room, in the way carriages seemed to slow just slightly when passing the gates, as though hoping to catch a glimpse of the scandal that everyone insisted was simmering just beneath the surface. And indeed, it was. It began with a sealed envelope delivered by private courier. Silas was in his study when he opened it. Grace had entered moments later to discuss arrangements for a scheduled visit to the shipyards, but she stopped short when she saw his expression, stone cold, unreadable, but for the flicker of something behind his eyes, shame, fury, fear. He handed her the papers without a word. They were copies, well forged but not flawless, bearing Silas's signature authorizing the loading of dangerous materials aboard the Winslow Belle. The date had been altered. The cargo details fabricated to make it appear he had knowingly risked the crew's lives for profit. At the bottom of the final page was a single line in red ink. Truth finds those who hide too long. Hoyle's style, Hoyle's venom. Grace set the pages down slowly. Her breath was steady, but inside her thoughts raced. "This is a lie," she said. Silas nodded once. "But it looks real enough to be believed." The implications were clear. If these forgeries made it into the hands of investors or the Maritime Commission, Silas would not only lose what remained of his reputation, he would face legal ruin. Grace didn't sleep that night. She returned to the library, to the ledgers she had begun cataloguing weeks ago. She retraced every manifest, cross-checked every seal, every signature, every notation. The writing was familiar, the spacing too consistent. Hoyle had planned this, but proving it would require more than intuition. The next day, she visited the dockyards, veiled and alone. She carried the original manifest from the Belle's final voyage, one she had retrieved quietly from Silas's private drawer. There, amid the crates and cranes and salt-stained ropes, she found what she hadn't dared to hope for. Henry Dawes was a dock worker in his early 50s, shoulders bent from decades of lifting, fingers curled from old injuries. He eyed Grace with suspicion when she first approached him. "I have nothing to say to Weatherly's wife," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "I'm not here as his wife," she replied. "I'm here as a woman who buried good men in silence." That gave him pause. When she showed him the manifest, his eyes narrowed. "I signed off on that load," he muttered, "but that's not my writing." Grace felt her heart leap. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I am that Hoyle paid me $100 to keep quiet about the extra barrels." He glanced around nervously. "I didn't know people would die," he said. "I just thought it was smuggling, cheap fraud, nothing more." Grace took his hand in both of hers. "You may be the only person who can save the truth." He nodded. "But it won't be easy, and it won't be safe." She left the docks that evening with ink-stained fingers and a letter in Henry's hand. A sworn account of the bribe, of the falsified inventory, and of Hoyle's threats should he ever speak again. She felt like she was breathing for the first time in weeks. But while Grace was searching for truth, Lillian Graves was preparing a new lie. The encounter happened after a luncheon. Lillian, draped in crimson and gloved in cunning, cornered Silas in the Weatherly carriage as he exited the event alone. She stepped inside uninvited, the perfume of roses and arsenic clinging to her. "I know what you've lost," she said softly, running a finger along the edge of his lapel. "But you don't have to lose yourself." He didn't respond. "I could make this disappear," she continued. "The whispers, the doubt, the mess she's brought into your home. One word from my father and Hoyle will vanish." "And in return?" Silas asked, his voice as cold as the steel beneath his coat buttons. "Return?" She smiled, leaning in close. "Only that you remember what it was like to be admired by someone who knows what you once were." He met her eyes without blinking. "What I once was is a man who chose silence over justice," he said. "I will not add cowardice to the list." She laughed. "You think this girl, this factory-born saint, will save you?" He opened the carriage door. "I think she already has." And then, with all the fury of a gentleman scorned and a man reborn, he stepped out into the sunlight and left Lillian to her rage. 3 days later, the anonymous column appeared. It ran in the Newport Gazette, signed only by a watchful eye. The article accused Grace of social manipulation, of seducing a grieving widower for financial gain, of whispering lies into the ears of a once great man to tarnish the legacy of his late wife. It described the charity ball as a performance of vanity. It claimed that the Weatherly children were now being raised by a woman with no breeding, no past, and soon no place in polite society. Grace read the words in silence. She did not cry, but something inside her splintered. By evening, she had packed her trunks. The night was heavy with unshed rain. The house was quiet except for the creak of wood beneath her steps. In the nursery, she paused. Caroline's voice startled her. "You're leaving." Grace turned. The girl stood in the doorway, hair unbraided, eyes rimmed with something too old to be sorrow. "You weren't meant to see," Grace said softly. "I'm not blind," Caroline replied. "I thought it best," Grace began. "Don't," Caroline said. She crossed the room slowly. "You came when we were all ghosts. You brought light into a house that forgot how to feel." Grace's breath hitched. "We were never safe," Caroline said, her voice cracking. "Not until you came." The final word landed like a stone in Grace's heart. "I don't care what they write," Caroline whispered. "I don't care what they say. You're the first person who didn't leave." Grace sank to her knees. Caroline, the girl who never cried, let herself fall into her arms. That night, the trunks remained unopened. The rain came just before dawn, washing the ink from the scandal sheets piled beneath the hedges outside. And in the warm hush of the nursery, Grace lay beside the children, her hands entwined with theirs, listening to the storm cleanse the world of lies. She would stay, not out of duty, but because love, like truth, refused to be silenced. The air in Newport that morning was thick with salt and whispers. News of the trustees' emergency assembly had swept through parlors and porticos like wildfire, each invitation hastily extended, each arrival cloaked in curiosity and scandal. The chamber of the Newport Commerce Hall, usually reserved for tepid speeches on tariffs and shipping routes, now bristled with silk, suspicion, and silver-tipped canes. No one expected Silas Weatherly to appear. Fewer still believed he would speak. And yet, just past the striking of 11, the tall doors opened and he entered alone. The room, once buzzing, fell into a hush that bordered on reverence. Silas wore no mourning band and no cravat pin, only a dark wool coat, pressed but worn, and the quiet dignity of a man who had known ruin and was no longer afraid of it. He stepped to the front, glancing at no one. Then his voice rang out, measured, low and unwavering. "You have heard much about Grace Bennet," he began, eyes scanning the crowd with a steadiness that made even the most hardened matrons lean forward. She arrived in Newport not as a social climber, nor a seductress, nor a pawn, but as a woman bound by the terms of another man's will and a courage that belongs solely to her. He paused. Several in the back murmured. A breath caught in someone's throat. I, Silas Weatherly, once commanded ships and men. I built fortunes and buried them. But never, not even at my height, have I seen loyalty like hers. She did not come for jewels or invitations. She came for my children when I could not look them in the eye. She came for this estate when I was ready to let it rot. The chamber remained still. Lillian Graves, seated in the third row beside her father, clutched her gloves tightly, her jaw rigid. Silas's voice grew rough, but it did not falter. You have whispered that she bought her place. I tell you, she earned it more than I ever did mine. If you wish to discuss reputations, then discuss mine, for it was my signature on the final cargo manifest. It was I who overlooked Hoyle's clever omissions, and it was Grace Bennet who uncovered the truth I had long buried in shame. With that, he stepped back. The silence did not break for several seconds. When it did, it was not with applause, but with an audible exhale, a collective release of judgment long held in the lungs of Newport's elite. That afternoon, Grace returned. She rode alone, seated beside Henry Dawes, the former dockworker who now trembled slightly beside her with both fear and relief. Behind them in a black carriage were 3 crates, original manifests, private correspondence between Hoyle and brokers, and an affidavit signed by Dawes himself. It was not just enough. It was ironclad. They met Silas in the drawing room, flanked by 2 representatives from the insurance consortium. The men, flushed and perspiring, listened without interruption as Grace laid out each piece of evidence. Her voice was cool, her hands did not tremble. When she finished, one of the men, a portly gentleman with a ring of sweat staining his collar, cleared his throat. Well, he muttered, I dare say there's no need for further scandal, is there? No, Silas said flatly, there isn't. And just like that, the matter was settled. Hoyle left Newport that evening on the 6 o'clock train, his departure unaccompanied by so much as a farewell. His estate, long praised for its ostentation, was lit only by a single gas lamp. By morning it was confirmed the insurers would pay in full. The Weatherly accounts were solvent. The ship registry had been amended, and Grace Bennet's name was noted in the official minutes as the party responsible for the evidence provided. Lillian's anonymous column was traced to her own writing desk, the style unmistakable. She was uninvited from the final ball of the season, her name scratched from the guest list with such decisiveness that even her mother's pleas to the committee were met with silence. But the house on Cliff Walk remained quiet that night. The children were asleep. Mrs. Talbot had gone to her room early, murmuring something about finally breathing again. Silas sat in the study, the fire low and casting long shadows on the panelled walls. Grace entered softly, not as a guest, not as an intruder, but as someone who had stopped knocking. She stood by the hearth, her reflection flickering faintly in the glass decanter beside him. He rose. From his coat pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. In his other hand, he held the gold ring, the one he had worn on a chain since his wife's passing. I have worn this, he said quietly, because I did not know how to let go. I do not wear it now. He set it gently on the mantel. Then he opened the box. Inside, nestled in soft satin, was a ring. Simple, not ornate. A solitary pearl set in a band of brushed gold. I asked you to marry me once by condition, he said, his voice unsteady for the first time that day. I ask you now by choice. Grace did not move. She looked at the ring, then at him, and in her gaze there was no triumph, no performance, only a hurricane of tenderness and terror. I don't know yet, she whispered. Silas nodded. He did not press her. Later, when the house had darkened and the fire had dimmed, Grace slipped into the garden, where moonlight made silver threads of the hedgerows. She walked to the orchard wall, the same place where Caroline once dared her to last a season. The same place where she'd once longed to run. Mrs. Talbot was there, folding sheets by lamplight in the side corridor, as if the walls might fall in without her precise hands. When Grace lingered, she looked up. "I don't know if I'm the right person to answer a proposal," Grace murmured. "I was chosen once because I was useful. I need to know what it means to be chosen in love." The housekeeper's gaze softened. "Then make him wait, child. If it's love, it will wait with its hat off and hands folded." Grace turned her face back toward the window of the study, where the silhouette of Silas still lingered, unmoving, quiet, and illuminated by the flicker of firelight. In that moment, she did not yet say yes, but she also did not run. She stood there with the scent of apple blossoms returning to the air and let the night wind braid around her the beginnings of something not demanded, but born. Something that could no longer be named by duty or inheritance, but something that in time might be called love. Autumn draped itself over Newport with the quiet grace of a cathedral veil. Leaves the color of garnets and gold drifted from the elms along Cliff Walk, carpeting the stone paths of the Weatherly estate in warm silence. The brine in the wind had softened. The sea, once turbulent and cold, now shimmered like polished pewter under a gentle sun. Grace stood at the top of the stone steps, overlooking the garden she had once feared to tread. The grounds had changed, not in structure, but in spirit. The vines that clung to the eastern wall had been trimmed back, not with hired hands, but by Edward himself, who now spent his afternoons among sawdust and salt, carving miniature ships that no longer made his breath catch in panic. He was no longer afraid of the sea. That legacy, too, was being rewritten. Inside, the once lifeless nursery echoed with laughter. Caroline, now 12, had taken it upon herself to teach letters and rhymes to the younger children of staff and neighbours, guiding their small fingers over pages with a patient pride that could not be taught. She had arranged the chairs in a circle herself, recited the poems by lantern light, and insisted that Miss Bennet, no, Mrs. Weatherly, display their drawings in the parlour for all to see. Grace never removed them. The house had changed because the people within it had found breath again. Curtains no longer remained drawn. Rooms once shuttered were aired and sunlit. The clocks ticked with regularity. Mrs. Talbot, after weeks of threatening it, finally admitted she might retire before spring. She still made her rounds with military precision, but now she allowed Grace to catch her humming as she folded linens in the morning room. "I'll haunt the linen closets if you forget starch," she warned one afternoon, her tone as sharp as ever, though her eyes gleamed with something dangerously close to affection. "I wouldn't dream of tempting your ghost," Grace replied. That evening, as twilight settled over the estate and the fire crackled in the drawing-room hearth, Grace found herself walking the orchard path alone. She wore a deep plum shawl embroidered with thread as pale as frost, a gift from the staff that Caroline had insisted on presenting with a curtsy, and the words, "For the mistress of the house." It had taken Grace a moment to answer, not from surprise, but from the quiet recognition that it was, at last, true. She passed the low stone wall, her footsteps silent on the earth. The air was scented with apples now, the fruit hanging heavy on branches that had once seemed too brittle to bear anything. It was here that she found him. Silas stood with his back to her, gazing at the far slope where the last of the season's leaves clung stubbornly to the trees. He wore no cravat, no waistcoat, only a heavy wool coat the colour of smoke, the collar turned up against the breeze. His hair, silvering at the temples, stirred slightly as he turned to face her. They did not speak at first. They didn't need to. The months between them had built a language that required no translation, only the quiet pulse of presence and the hush that falls before something sacred. He reached into his coat pocket, not abruptly, not theatrically, as if it had always been meant to rest there. "I asked once," he said softly, stepping closer, "and I asked again. Both times you could have said no." Grace looked at him, her eyes steady. Silas dropped to one knee, not in spectacle, but in reverence. The velvet box rested in his hand once more, unopened. "I would rather live in ruin with you," he said, "than reign without you." The words did not echo. They sank into the soil beneath them, into the walls that had once borne only grief, into the marrow of every silence they had once endured. Grace's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the flood of certainty that rose behind her ribs. She knelt before him, their shadows merging in the dying light. "Yes," she whispered. It was not triumphant. It was not a banner raised or a victory claimed. It was something gentler, like the sound of the tide returning to shore after a long absence. The answer that had always lived quietly between them, waiting to be spoken aloud. Their kiss was not rushed. It was not the spark of new passion, but the tender confirmation of something earned. When his hand touched her cheek, he did not pull her into an embrace, as men in novels so often did. He simply held her there, eyes closed, the weight of seasons lifted. When they rose, it was not as a man and woman meeting in transaction, nor even as husband and wife by obligation. They rose as partners, not in contract but in choice. Later that week, the town spoke not of scandals, but of the surprising quiet strength of the Weatherly name. Children brought hand-drawn thank-you notes to the estate, tied in string. The baker sent extra loaves. A telegram arrived from an old shipmate who had read of Grace's efforts in the papers and signed it. "To the woman who righted what we could not." In the sewing room, Grace found the old ledgers. She did not burn them. She wrapped them in muslin and placed them beside her mother's steamer trunk, now polished and restored. History, she had come to understand, did not need to be erased. It needed to be faced, and then honored, and then surpassed. By the end of October, Caroline had taken to calling her Mama when no one was listening. Edward had asked if he might one day have a real ship, not carved, but full-sized with sails. Grace had smiled. "I imagine you might." Mrs. Talbot still patrolled the hallways, but now she wore soft slippers and allowed herself the indulgence of afternoon tea. The staff no longer whispered when Grace entered. They greeted her. They told her when she missed meals. They left posies by her door. And Grace, once a mill girl with no family, but a mother's faded letters, now stood in the halls of a house she had not merely entered, but saved. She did not wear diamonds. She did not host grand dinners for nobility, but she walked with the quiet authority of someone who had earned every corner of every room she stepped into. As the last leaves fell and the lamps were lit earlier each evening, Grace stood once more by the orchard wall. Silas joined her. No proposals, no rings, only hands that touched in passing and did not part. The Weatherly name, once stained and whispered with pity, had become something else entirely, not a monument to loss, but a promise kept. The orchard behind the Weatherly estate stood golden once more, its branches heavy with fruit, though the world around it had changed in quiet, irrevocable ways. The old stone wall, worn soft by time, still marked the edge of the garden where a man had once knelt with a question that had rewritten the fate of a house, and the woman who answered him. Grace stood barefoot in the grass, her skirts gathered loosely at her ankles, the late October breeze tugging at strands of hair that had long since refused to obey pins. A soft laugh bubbled nearby, and she turned just in time to catch a glimpse of two small figures darting between the trees, one with raven-dark hair, the other with curls like copper kissed by firelight. "Mama!" the youngest called, clutching a branch of half-bitten apples. "We found the biggest one." "Did you ask the tree first?" Grace asked with a playful raise of her brow. "Trees don't talk," said the eldest with the certainty of 7 years. Grace smiled. "They do, if you listen properly." From the veranda, Silas watched them, his hand resting atop a cane more for habit than need. His hair had gone fully silver now, but the weight that had once dragged at his posture no longer lingered in his frame. He had aged, yes, but not as a man diminished, as one fulfilled. He joined her at the orchard path a moment later, and though neither spoke, she leaned gently into his side. Their fingers found each other without ceremony. They had named their first daughter Eliza, after Grace's mother, and their second, Josephine, for a name that had always made Silas think of resilience wrapped in softness. Caroline had grown into a young woman of poise and fierce intellect, now studying languages in Boston and writing her father with complaints about corsets and praise for newspapers finally printing women's opinions. Edward, now 15, had taken to the shipyards as apprentice designer, sketching with the precision of a man twice his age. His ships bore no ghosts, only ambition. He no longer whispered in his sleep. The house, once murmuring with sorrow, had grown loud, gloriously so. With music, with footsteps, with laughter and crying and messes no housekeeper could contain. Mrs. Talbot had indeed retired, but she had not left. She lived in the gatekeeper's cottage with her niece and a cat with no name, and she came every Sunday to inspect the linens, muttering about the decline of starch standards with theatrical disapproval. She had never haunted the closets, but she had never let go either. And what of society? Newport changed, as all things do. Some names faded, others rose. Lillian Graves had married a German baron and left America in a whirlwind of lace and scandal. Her column, once venomous, was now quoted in etiquette classes as an example of what not to do. Clarence Hoyle's name had all but disappeared. No statue was ever erected in his memory, but occasionally, on damp coastal mornings, a fisherman might still spit at the sound of it. But most telling of all, at the Trustees' Winter Gala, now co-hosted by Grace Weatherly, young girls from both sides of the avenue curtsied with the same reverence, whether a guest wore inherited diamonds or hands calloused by work. It had not been a revolution, but it had been a beginning. Grace had never sought legacy. And yet, in the eyes of the women who lingered after dances to thank her for opening the Weatherly Library to factory children, or in the letters from orphans whose mothers once scrubbed the estate's floors, it was clear she had built one. Her love with Silas had not dimmed. It had deepened, matured, weathered its seasons with the same grace as the orchard. They still argued sometimes, about supper guests, about discipline, about whether a man of 60 could climb a ladder to prune a limb without falling. But every quarrel ended as it always had, with truth and with tenderness. That evening, after the girls were tucked in and the lamps turned low, Grace stepped out onto the veranda once more. The sky above was streaked with indigo and rust, and the scent of cinnamon from the kitchen drifted like memory. Silas joined her, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. 8 years, he murmured. She nodded. And I would choose it all again, even the hardest days. He looked at her then, not as a man who had been saved, nor as a husband who had learned to love again, but as someone who had spent a lifetime learning what love truly was. You did not just save this house, Grace, he said. You made it worth saving. They stood in silence, the kind that only love of many seasons can bear, the kind that hums rather than echoes. And from the nursery above, the sound of 2 sisters laughing in their sleep drifted through the window, like a lullaby carried by the wind. The Weatherly name no longer bore the weight of tragedy. It no longer whispered of scandal or ruin. Now it meant legacy. Now it meant love that endured. Now it meant home. And so Grace and Silas taught us something timeless. That love does not arrive when it is most convenient, nor in the form we imagined. It arrives when we are brave enough to open the door, even with trembling hands. It takes root in unlikely soil. It grows stronger through storms, and when chosen freely, not out of duty, but from the deepest place of truth, it becomes the kind of love that rebuilds homes, heals old names, and changes the course of generations. This story, set in the grand but crumbling halls of the Gilded Age, reminds us that dignity is not about wealth, but about the way we carry one another through sorrow. That sometimes the smallest act of kindness, a hand steadied at the right moment, a word spoken in truth, can shape the future more than any fortune ever could. If this journey moved you, if Grace's courage and Silas's redemption stirred something in your heart, we invite you to leave a comment below and share what this story meant to you. And if you made it to the end, write the word "chosen" in the comments, so we'll know you stayed until the very last breath of this love story. It means more than you can imagine. If you'd like to support the team behind these historical tales and help us keep bringing them to life, you're warmly welcome to click the Super Thanks button and contribute whatever amount you feel moved to offer. Your generosity allows these stories to reach more hearts, and for that, we are deeply grateful. And if you're not able to support financially, that's perfectly okay. Another beautiful way to help is by sharing this video with a friend, a sister, or someone you know who still believes in the kind of love that defies time, class, and fear. We also invite you to explore the other unforgettable love stories we've left for you in the video cards above. Each one carries a soul of its own, and just maybe, a part of yours will live there too. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling with us. And until the next story, may you always choose love.